Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of What's Going On, and I'm your host Tom DeAmber, and as always we're very thankful that you spend your busy day with us. If you got to watch our show last week, we were getting into a little bit more of the Hegelian dialect, and what that was, in case you didn't see the show, was problem, reaction, solution. They usually cause a problem through an intentional crisis to get the desired, I should say, reaction out of the general people, the general population, and then the solution will be to strengthen their authority. We did get into a little bit, actually quite heavily, if you didn't see the show, about the drug trading orchestrated throughout the world by the United States government. We demonstrated to you through a statement by William Casey, a former CIA director, about the cocaine trade back in the 80s and 90s. We also got into some things with cocaine with regards to Ted Gunderson, when President Reagan went to Ted Gunderson and asked him to please investigate where the cocaine was coming from. President Reagan decided that this was a menace, a threat to the society of our nation. So he took Ted Gunderson, who was the leading investigator for the FBI at the time, and had him put his own investigative group together. And then what he did was he said, okay, Ted, you are going to answer to myself and Al Haig only. We're going to get rid of all the bureaucracy. So about 5 to 6 months later, Ted Gunderson walked into the White House, and Mr. Reagan asked Ted Gunderson, okay, Ted, what did you discover? And to use Ted Gunderson's words, he said, Mr. President, the United States government is the biggest drug dealer in the world. And what we want to demonstrate again, and we're going to get into this real briefly, folks, because as we promised last week, we're going to get into the mechanism, another great mechanism of the bankers, and that is war. But what I want to do real briefly is go over Mr. Casey's statement again. Now, you got to understand that Mr. Casey, he was the director of the CIA. He also died, as we got into last week, very mysteriously. He was found dead in a boat on a river. But anyway, this is Bill Casey, CIA director, on December 9th, 1986. And he's actually making a declaration here. I, William J. Casey, declare that I have found that freedom is a priceless commodity that demands constant vigilance to guarantee its longevity. I was told that A7 was the Phoenix program of Latin America. I was involved in the assassination of communist infrastructure throughout Latin America. Colby Kennedy informed me that he had prepositioned more than 1 million pounds of cocaine in Panama between December 1st, 1975 and April 1st, 1976. Now think of how much money we're talking here, folks. As I stated last week, I never get into the drug culture, but I believe that cocaine was sold in grams. So think of how, I don't know how many grams go into a pound, but when you're talking over 1 million pounds of cocaine, already pre-positioned and ready for delivery into the United States. This was done with the aid of our gallantly General Manuel Noriega. The cocaine was transported into El Salvador, Costa Rica, Honduras between 1976 and 1981. Colby now sat in front of me with hat in hand and requested my help in the delivery of the cocaine to the American market. Of course, now you got to understand, this fella is coming to the CIA director to help him facilitate transportation and distribution throughout the United States. I mean, does he know who's doing business here and who to do the business with? By 1984, all prepositioned cocaine had arrived in Mina Airport and additional cocaine sources were secured. Cocaine was being transshipped through hangars 4 and 5 at Alangapongo Air Base, El Salvador. My point man at Mina was Barry Seal. Bill Clinton has proved so invaluable by far containing the local law enforcement investigations into the intelligence activity at Mina. I ordered Joint Poindexter, Robert McFarlane, and Oliver North to go outside normal channels and use assets, including the Mafia, to ensure the arrival of the cocaine into Mina Airport. The arrival occurred in no small part through the efforts of personnel assigned to the National Security Agency and the Army Security Agency. The men and women of the NSA and ASA blinded early warning defense satellites and radar grid to enable the aircraft to land undetected at Mina Airport. The NSA and ASA operations were named Sea Spray and Jade Bridge. My actions may be recorded as criminal, condemning countless Americans to a drug dependency. I do not care. All wars produce casualty. Generally, the more violent the war, the shorter the length. My choice was either to stare down a protracted Cold War guerrilla insurgency in Latin America, or use the means available to me to finance a war of wage a war, of violent war of short duration for democracy. I stand by my decisions. The tool is cocaine. The trick is to understand the drug user and had the freedom to make this choice. They chose the drug. I choose to use their habit and dependency to finance the democracies of that all Americans enjoy. To keep those Americans safe from the communist threat knocking on our back door in Latin America, for a change, the drug user will contribute to society. Folks, we got into this in quite depth last week, but some things that you really want to think about and understand here. A couple of things. Number one, the United States government is in the drug pushing business, obviously. They have been for many years. We actually got into before on previous shows about different wars, and if you remember the two wars, one of the wars that we discussed was the Opium Wars, where the East India Company, through the British Crown, was actually battling and created war to control the opium trade throughout Asia and China and so forth. Okay. The other thing is you got to understand that the NSA, the National Security Agency, and the Army Security Agency actually were taking the satellites and setting them up in arrangement to create a window of opportunity for these for these planes to fly into Mena, Arkansas. You also got to understand that when they wanted to distribute the cocaine at a local distribution point, who they call on, the mafia. So they already had a working relationship with the mafia. But you think the mafia is, working against the government and vice versa. Folks, they work together. Okay, this statement clarifies that. And the other thing you got to understand is, look what happened to Bill Clinton. He was the governor of the state of Arkansas. They made arrangements with him to bring in all this cocaine through the Mena airport. Bill Clinton, through his powers and authority as the governor of that state, kept all the local law enforcement and state law enforcement away from the area for purposes of a safe and operation throughout the state and for a long period of time. We're talking over 5 years here, okay? And what'd they do to Bill Clinton? What'd they do to Bill Clinton, folks? They made him president of the United States. So we're going to stop here with this. I wanted to finish up with what we got into last week with the drug war. But another big thing that the powers to be use, and it's their most gainful one, is the tool of war. Folks, war is a tool. Do you remember in previous shows, I chose 10 of what I felt were the top false flag operations in the history of our country and some other countries. We got into things like the Gulf of Tonkin Revolution and so forth, with the USS Maddox never being attacked and all this. But war is a very, very centralizing tool. And what I mean by that is, if you have a perceived outside threat, it consolidates and centralizes the people psychologically. Oh, we have this outside threat. We have to circle the wagons, if you would, and do whatever our government says. And we have to send our sons and daughters because of this terrible threat. Folks, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and by 1991, we already had another enemy and another war. All right? Very, very important that you understand that. And what I want to get into a little bit, I know we've read this quote before on the show, but this is a very famous statement made at the Nuremberg trial by a gentleman by the name of Hermann Goering. And he's explaining his strategy here with regards to getting the common man, the common people behind the war effort. And listen to his words. On the Nuremberg trial, folks, was a war crime trial post-World War II, okay? They took all the Nazis that they didn't bring to the United States. Do you remember we got into Operation Paperclip? And if you really want to read something interesting, go ahead and Google Operation Paperclip. So let's get back into Hermann Goering and his statement about how to consolidate the people, how to lead the people down this avenue of war. Hermann Goering. Why, of course the people don't want war. Why should some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor, for that matter, even in Germany. That is understood, but after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the peacemakers for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. Very, very important, folks, that you understand this. War is a tool, okay? Remember that famous quote by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, nothing happens in politics by chance, all right? When you start researching Afghanistan, okay, we were putting troops and stationing and positioning troops in Afghanistan 3 to 4 months prior to us going into Afghanistan, 3 to 4 months prior to 9/11 actually taking place. All right, so we got into how FDR, how he moved the merchant marine shipping lanes south because we knew through cracking the Purple Code right where the Japanese were going to come from. They were going to use the northern shipping lanes and come into it. We talked about how FDR took Battleship Row that was in San Diego just 90 days prior, and we sent them and put them into Pearl Harbor. We knew the next war was not going to be fought with battleships, but the next war was going to be fought with aircraft carriers and that type of technology. So the battleships at that point were expendable. Okay, they were expendable in the sense that you wanted to get the public to have this reaction. So they lined them all up and they let the Japanese come in, and we know the history of what took place. So with that being said, there's some other ways that they instrument war, okay? And I just want to get into one common thing here. We talk about the Murrah Building, and I was doing some research here, and the Murrah Building happened quite a while ago, literally about 15 years ago. And I was doing the research. It really brought back to my mind some things of the time that took place. So I just want to get into, this is a United States Air Force report. This is a ballistic study, if you would. This is the United States Air Force on the Murrah Building in Oklahoma City that was detonated on April 19th, 1995. Okay. And later on, when this report went to the FBI, and big quotations here, the FBI admits that it lost 3,000 pages of evidence and testimony. How's that for an investigative unit, huh? They lost 3,000 pages of evidence and testimony. And that's not the only thing they lost at the Murrah Building, folks. They also lost 24 cameras that happened to be on the Murrah Building at the time of the event. This is some consolidating efforts here when you think about when you have the 9/11 with the Pentagon, you know, all the highway films that would have showed the plane going across, all of the films from the Pentagon, all the films from the hotel across the street, the Citgo station across the street, they were all confiscated with 20 to 30 minutes of the event taking place by the same agency, the FBI. Okay, here's this report. It is impossible to ascribe the damage that occurred on April 19th, 1995 to a single truck bomb containing 4,000 pounds of nitrate fertilizer mixture. In fact, the maximum predicted damage to the floor panels of the Murrah Federal Building is equal to approximately 1% of the total floor area of the building. What are they saying in layman's terms here? They're saying that if you took what the government prescribes to the American people of what Timothy McVeigh used to blow up this building, and you took the maximum effect, everything going right with what he had and supposedly used, you would only get approximately 1% of the total floor area damage to the building. How did the other 99% get destroyed, folks? They're going to get into that a little bit. It must be concluded that the damage of the Murrah Building is not the result of a truck bomb itself, but rather due to other factors such as locally placed charges within the building itself. This is the United States Air Force telling you this, okay? You got to understand, folks, and let me go on a little bit more before I break this down. A security camera filmed Timothy McVeigh at a McDonald's 24 minutes before the time stamped on the Ryder truck rental agreement. According to the rental agreements, the soaking wet clothes McVeigh was found wearing did not match the clothes worn by either men who actually rented the truck. The FBI maintains that McVeigh managed to travel the mile and a quarter from McDonald's to the rental agency alone and without a car in 20 minutes, without getting drenched by the rain, and before being browbeaten by FBI agents into changing their story. 3 clerks interviewed at the rental agency agreed that suspects number 1 and 2 were dry when they rented the Ryder truck. According to news reports, McVeigh was picked up within 2 hours of the bombing, driving south of Interstate 45, barefoot, no shirt. He was arrested while speeding with expired plates, no driver's license, and a loaded .45 caliber automatic on his front seat. Why didn't he just hang an arrest me sign on the truck? The Murrah massacre was immediately described by U.S. officials as revenge for Waco before McVeigh was captured and confessed to making a preemptive attack against a repressive fascist government in response to Waco. So you understand what they're saying here? They were already broadcasting McVeigh's words hours before he was even captured. Now, when you really do the research with the local police officer that actually captured McVeigh, folks, he was on the side of the road. He was quivering, crying, having a nervous breakdown, and as crazy as this may sound to you, he was crying to the police officer that there was a chip in him and he needed help. He needed to get away from them. I don't know who them are, but this is what McVeigh, according to local law enforcement statements, this is what he was saying, and this was the condition of his mind at the time of his arrest. Okay, what was a yellow rental Ryder truck matching the description of the Oklahoma bomb truck doing at the U.S. Army compound near Camp Gerber Braggs, Oklahoma, days before the Murrah building was destroyed? The military response report, corroborated by a FEMA situation report, was when noted a second and third bomb were located in the building. One unexploded bomb was found attached to a gas line inside the building. Folks, this is a FEMA situation report. And what a situation report is this? As this event is progressing and going along, there is logs made. There's logs made of situations that took place, of discoveries of evidence, of personnel involved in the investigation. So this situation log at this one particular time is reporting a second and third bomb located in the building, and one unexploded bomb was found attached to a gas line inside the building. Isn't that incredible? There is pages and pages of evidence here about the Murrah building in Oklahoma, and I'm going to finish with one last thing on it, and then we'll go on. The agencies of the IRS, the Social Security Administration, and the FBI were told on April 19th, 1995, not to come to work that morning. You can look this up for yourself. What they did allow to open up, though, was what? They opened up the daycare center for the people to bring their children, so when this explosion went off, they could get the reaction that they wanted from the American people by having these innocent children murdered and torn apart. You remember that famous photo, for anyone who was alive at the time, of the I believe it was a police officer giving a baby to a fireman. Very, very hard-hitting. If anything is going to stir the emotions of the American people, it's the protection of their children. Okay, so what happened after the Murrah building? ATF was expanded, and the anti-terrorism bill, which was kicked out of committee, never even made it to the floor. It was kicked out of committee a year earlier. Well, 90 days later, that very same bill was passed by the Congress of the United States. So not only did they play the American people problem, reaction, solution, they played the Congress of the United States. Create the crisis, they got the reaction from the Congress they wanted, the legislation was passed within 90 days of the Murrah building going up. So there's different mechanisms of war. There's outside threat. There's the domestic threat. And what do you do with the domestic threat? Okay, you strengthen the authority domestically within the United States, a police state, if you would. Okay, financing goes up because the people approve it for their safety. All right, domestic force, police forces are strengthened, and the liberties of the people are taken away, slowly and incrementally taken away from the people, all in the sense of safety. And what was it that Ben Franklin reminded us of in his famous quote about security? Those who give up liberty for the sense of security deserve neither. And Thomas Jefferson coined in with that when he said, a people who wish to remain ignorant and free expect what never was and never will be. And this is, folks, and you got to think about the media. What did the media show you with the events of the Murrah building? All you knew was what the United States government was. They didn't do their own investigative report. They didn't ask why were these cameras taken away. Well, let's show Timothy McVeigh with the truck and the bomb. How come they didn't show this Air Force report saying that if everything went right with what Timothy McVeigh supposedly had, he was only going to get 1% collateral damage compared to what took place at the building? That's the United States Air Force. How come they didn't cover the FBI losing over 3,000 pages of evidence for this investigation? Why? And it's the same thing with 9/11. Okay, we have showed documentaries on this show regarding 9/11. I think we have demonstrated to you that quite blankly that there are questions that need to be answered with the whole event of September 11th. So the mechanism of war. You remember our warning by President Eisenhower in his farewell address about the industrial military complex? We also had the warning by George Washington, our first president, with regards to his farewell address when he said, political entanglements with none, commerce with all. And what he was talking about was, you know, he didn't want, like we have these mutual defense and mutual defense agreements and mutual aid agreements with different countries so that if one country goes to war, we automatically jump in the middle of the war. Okay, this is what he's talking about, but he wanted commerce with all. Because you got to understand, folks, at that time, the only revenue input from the United States government, the federal government, was tariffs. And what's a tariff? If you're going to import something into this country, you had to pay a tariff to do business in this country. And because the federal government was so small, that the United States government had federal government had plenty of money without extracting revenue from the American people domestically, because of our laissez-faire economy. You know, they put these nice pretty words, open trade, you know, these free trade agreements, okay? Well, when you read these free trade agreements, there's over 2,600 pages of laws and stipulations. Why do you need 2,600 pages of language, of restricting language, to facilitate free trade? They put these pretty words on it, the Freedom to Farm Act. Oh, we're going to support this bill. The Freedom to Farm Act sounds beautiful, sounds benevolent. But when you really do the research, the Freedom to Farm Act destroyed the vast majority of the family farms in this country, and all of the wealth of is now, and the food production in this country is now geared to corporate Monsantos and so forth, corporations that control the agriculture in this country, along with federal agencies, Department of Agriculture, and so forth. So again, problem, reaction, solution. So with regards to the profits of war, I want to get into, because of time's sake, we've already gone a little bit, I want to get into a book that was written by a gentleman who is one of my absolute heroes in American history, and his name was Smedley Butler. Smedley Butler was a Marine who was awarded 2 Congressional Medal of Honors. Not 1, 2 Congressional Medal of Honors. And folks, let me tell you, they do not give those things away. And most of the people that are awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor is posthumously. They were killed in the event that warranted them the award. Anyway, Smedley Butler was a true American. He spent 33 and a half years in the United States Marine Corps, fought in many, many campaigns, and he was in the front lines with it. Okay, he wasn't some, rock-around general back at the Pentagon collecting funds and making money and making percentage on every pair of combat boots he sold or arranged, or every pair of whatever, stockings, whichever. But he wrote a book at the end of his career, and it's called War is a Racket. And it's I have a small condensed version of this book, and I'm going to try to almost read it verbatim to you. And I want you to listen to this man's words, okay? Because the only thing that has changed here about the mechanism of war is that now the profits are greater. That's the only thing that's changed. And let's listen to the words of General Smedley Butler, two-time Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one of international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. In the Great War, now folks, he's talking about World War I. Okay, it was known as the Great War. As a matter of fact, President Wilson, he ran on a peace platform. Isn't that interesting? Just like the current president today, he ran on a peace platform. And what's going on today, folks? What's going on today? Major profits since President Obama's taken office. Bank is getting $23.7 trillion. Defense budget's going up. 70,000 more contractors and/or troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now we're pushing the war into Pakistan, as we're sending special forces into Pakistan, and we're using missiles and aerial strikes into Pakistan, an independent sovereign nation. Back to General Butler. In the Great World War, a mere handful garnered the profits of the conflict. At least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made in the United States during this war. That many admitted their huge blood gains in their income tax returns. How many other war millionaires falsified their tax returns, no one really knows. How many of these war millionaires shouldered a rifle? How many of them dug a trench? How many of these millionaires knew what it meant to go hungry in a rat-infested dugout? How many of them spent sleepless, frightened nights ducking shells and shrapnel and machine gun bullets? How many of them parried a bayonet thrust into one of an enemy? How many of them were wounded or killed in battle? Out of wars, nations acquire additional territory if they are victorious. They just take it. This is newly acquired territory promptly is exploited by the few. The self-same few who wrung dollars out of blood in the war. The general public shoulders the bill. And what is this bill? This bill renders a horrible accounting, newly placed gravestones, mangled bodies, shattered minds, broken hearts and homes, economic instability, depression in all of its attendant miseries, backbreaking taxation for generations and generations to come. For a great many years as a soldier, he was a Marine, I had a suspicion that war was a racket. Not until I retired to civil life did I fully realize it. Now that I see the international war clouds gathering as they are today, I must face it and speak out. Folks, what he's talking about in this period right here, this is just prior to World War II. Again, they are choosing sides. France and Russia met and agreed to stand by side. Italy and Austria hurried to make a similar agreement. Poland and Germany are casting sheep's eyes at each other, forgetting the nonce. Folks, a nonce is a unique occasion, okay? Forgetting the nonce, their dispute over the Polish corridor. The assassination of King Alexander of Yugoslavia complicated matters. Yugoslavia and Hungary, long bitter enemies, were almost at each other's throats immediately. Italy was ready to jump in, but France was waiting. So was Czechoslovakia. All of them looking ahead to war. Not the people, Not those who fight, pay, and die, only those who foment wars and remain safely at home to profit. There are 40 million men under arms in the world today, and our statesmen and diplomats have the temerity to say that war is not in the making. Hell's bells. Are these 40 million men being trained to be dancers? Not in Italy, to be sure. Premier Mussolini knows what they are being trained for. He, at least, is frank enough to speak out. Only the other day, El Duce, as he was called in Italy, in international consolation, the publication of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Now, this is El Duce speaking, Premier Mussolini. And above all, fascism, the more it considers and observes the future and the development of humanity, quite apart from political considerations of the moment, believes that neither in the possibility nor in the utility of perpetual peace. War alone brings up its highest tensions of all energy, human energy, and puts the stamp of nobility upon the people who have the courage to meet it. And what he's talking about here, folks, is sending the people who have the courage to go to war, because they've garnished war in glory. Okay, you see the commercials on TV, the recruitment commercials. They've garnished the war in glory. Folks, the people who have seen real war, the people who have experienced true combat, do not speak of war that much. I knew a lot of combat veterans from my time in the service, and also my father himself was a decorated combat veteran from Korea. I grew up during the Vietnam era, went in the Marine Corps at the very, very end of the Vietnam era, and I will tell you, the people who have experienced the horrors of war do not speak much of it, because it is horrific. Back to General Butler. Undoubtedly, Mussolini means exactly what he says. His well-trained army, his great fleet of planes, and even his navy are ready for war and anxious for it. His recent stand at the side of Hungary in the latest dispute with Yugoslavia showed that in the hurried mobilization of his troops on the Austrian border after the aggression of Dollfuss showed it too. There are others in Europe too whose saber-rattling prestigious war sooner or later. Here Hitler, with his rearming Germany and his constant demands for more and more arms, is an equal, if not greater, menace to peace. France only recently increased the terms of military service for its youth from a year to 18 months. Yes, overall, nations are camping in their arms. Mad dogs of Europe are on the loose. In the Orient, the maneuvering is more adroit. Back in 1904, when Russia and Japan fought, we kicked out our old friends, the Russians, and backed Japan. Then our very generous international bankings were our very generous international bankers were financing Japan. Now the trend is to poison to us against the Japanese. What does the open door policy to China mean to us? Our trade with China is about $90 million a year. Or is it the Philippine Islands? Have we spent about $600 million in the Philippines in 35 years, and we, our bankers and industrialists and speculators, have private investments worth of less than $200 million. What he's asking, folks, is why have we spent $600 million in the Philippines to facilitate the Philippines, and this is all going on, yet the bankers, industrials, and speculators have their private investments there of just $200 million. And what he's saying here is that, the United States government is doing the protection services of the international bankers. Back to General Butler. Then to say that China's trade of $90 million or to protect these private investments of less than $200 million in the Philippines would be all stirred up to hate Japan and to go to war. A war that might well cost us tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives of Americans, and many more hundreds of thousands of physically maimed and mentally unbalanced men. Of course, for this loss, there will be a compensating profit. Fortunes will be made. Millions and billions of dollars will be piled up by just a few. Munition makers, bankers, shipbuilders, manufacturing, meat packers, speculators, and again, the international banksters will all fare well. Yes, they are getting ready for another war. Why shouldn't they? It pays extremely high dividends. But what does it profit the men who are killed? What does it profit the mothers and sisters, the wives and their sweethearts? What does it profit their children? What does it profit anyone except the very few to whom war means huge profits? Yes, what it does is profit the bankers. Take our own case. Until 1898, we didn't own a bit of territory outside the mainland of North America. At that time, our national debt was very little. Then we became internationally minded. We forgot or shunted aside the advice of the father of our country. We forgot George Washington's warnings about entangling alliances. We went to war. We acquired outside territory. At the end of the World War period, as a direct result of fiddling in international affairs, our national debt has jumped over to $25 trillion. Folks, think of that figure. This is after World War I, when the American dollar still had some purchasing power, still had some intrinsic value to it, as we've spoken in previous shows. $25 trillion. That's a lot of profits. Back to General Butler. Our total favorable trade balance during the 25-year period was about $24 trillion. Do you understand what he's saying here? Okay? We outspent what we made from the gross domestic product. Therefore, on a purely bookkeeping basis, we ran a little behind year for year, and that foreign trade might as well been ours without the wars. It would have been far cheaper, not to say safer, for the average American who pays the bills to stay out of the foreign entanglements. For a very few, this racket, like bootlegging and other underworld rackets, brings fancy profits. But the cost of the operations is always transferred to the people who do not profit. Who makes the profits? The World War, rather than our brief participation in it, has cost the United States some $52 trillion. Figure it out. That is well over $400 to every American man, woman, and child, and we haven't even paid the debt yet. We are paying for it now. Our children will pay for it, and our children's children will still be paying the cost of this war. And that is absolutely true, folks. We have gotten to the debt before. I'm going to continue here, but his statement is true today, almost 100 years later. The normal profits of a business concern in the United States are 6, 8, 10, and sometimes as high as 12%. Folks, he's talking about profit margins here, okay? The average American business doing profit in this country at the time, their profit margins were 6, 8, 10, and sometimes as high as 12%, okay? So, but wartime profits, that is another matter. 20, 60, 100, 300, even 1,800%. The sky is the limit in war. All that traffic will bear. Uncle Sam has the money, so let's go get it. So he's comparing here the profits of, say, the civilian world non-military industrial complex going as high as 12% on average, okay? But when you look at the profits of the warmongers, the people who facilitate the needs of war, their profits are in the 1,800 percentile bracket. I'd want war too, wouldn't you, if you were on the other end of it? If you and yours were not going to bleed, and you and yours were going to make an 1,800% profit that is guaranteed by an insolvent corporation whose checks are still good, great racket. Back to General Butler. Of course, it isn't put that crudely in wartime. It is dressed up in speeches about patriotism, love of country. We must all put our shoulders to the wheel. But the profits jump and leap and skyrocket and are safely pocketed. Let's just take a look at a few examples. Take our friends the DuPonts, the powder people. Didn't one of them testify before a Senate committee recently that their powder won the war or saved the world for democracy or something to that matter? How did they do in war? Were they a patriotic corporation? Well, the average earnings of the DuPonts for the period of 1910 to 1914 was $6 million a year. It wasn't much to the DuPonts, but they managed to get along on it. Now let's look at their average yearly profit from the war years 1914 to 1918. $58 million a year in profit we find, nearly 10 times that of the normal times, and the profits of the normal times were still pretty good, an increase of profits of more than 950%. Take one of our little steel companies that patriotically shunted aside the making of rails and girders and bridges to manufacture war materials. Well, their 1910 and 1914 yearly earnings averaged $6 million again. Then came the war, and like the loyal citizens they are, Bethlehem Steel promptly turned to munitions making. Did their profits jump, or did they let Uncle Sam get in for a bargain? Well, their 1914 and 1918 average was $49 billion a year. Now, folks, I want you to think of this. Their average profits before the war was $6 million a year, and during the war, it was $49 billion a year. Well, let's take the United States Steel. The normal earnings during the 5-year period prior to the war were $105 billion. Not bad. Then came along the war and their profits went up. The average yearly profit for that period was $240 billion a year. So that more than doubled. There you have some of the steel and powder earnings. But let's look at something else. A little copper perhaps. They always do well in war times. Anaconda, for instance, average yearly earnings during the pre-war years of 1910 and 1914 were $10 million a year. During the war years, their profits leaped to $34 billion a year. Utah Copper, average of $5 million per year. During the war period, $21 million a year. Let's group these five with similar companies. The total yearly average profits of the pre-war period of 1910 and 1914 were $137 million. Then came the war. The average yearly profits for this group skyrocketed to over $408 million. An increase in profits of over 200%. Does war pay? It paid very well for them, but they aren't the only ones. There are still others. Let's take a look at leather. For the 3-year period before the war, the total profits of Central Leather Company were $3.5 million. That was approximately $1.1 million a year. Well, in 1916, General Leather returned a profit of $15 million, a small increase of 1,100%. That's all. The General Chemical Company averaged a profit for 3 years before the war of $800,000 a year. Came the war, and the profits jumped to $12 million a year, a leap in percentage of profit of over 1,400%. International Nickel Company, and you can't have a war without nickel, showed an increase in profits from a mere average of $4 million a year to $73 million a year. Not bad, an increase of more than 1,700%. American Sugar Refining Company averaged $2 million a year for the 3 years before the war, and during the war averaged $6 million. Listen to Senate document number 259 of the 65th Congress reporting on corporate earnings and government revenues. Concerning the profits of 122 meat packers, 153 cotton manufacturers, 299 garment makers, and 49 steel plants, and 340 coal producers during the war, profits under 25% were exceptional. For instance, the coal companies made between 100% and 7,856% on their capital stock during the war. Folks, think of that. 7,856% increase in capital stock during the war. The Chicago Packers doubled and tripled their earnings. And let's not forget the bankers who financed this great war. Let's stop right there. The financing of the war, folks, is where the real money is made. Now, we just went over all these astronomical profit margins. We went over all these astronomical earnings and jumps from peacetime to wartime. And you can say, oh my God, I'm just amazed with that. Folks, you're going to be absolutely dumbfounded by the profits of the bankers who finance all this mechanism of war, these materials, these ships, planes, boots, guns, bullets. Okay? That's small peanuts compared to the people who print money with no intrinsic value out of thin air and then charge you or charge you, yes you. They charge the government, folks. Who do you think backs the government? Your laborers do. So I want you to think about, yeah, 7,800% profit. That's nothing to the bankers. And the reason being is because what they do, they finance this mess. Okay? If the war cost $2.5 trillion, they merely make an entry on a ledger, give the United States Treasury permission to print the so-called money. Of course, as we've gotten into other shows, we do not have money. And if you missed that show, you really missed a great show, because we demonstrated quite blankly through Law's Dictionary and through the language of what currency is and through the different currency acts of this nation during the founding era that we do not have a dollar. We do not have money. We have Federal Reserve notes. Federal Reserve, again, being a private bank, and a note being an acknowledgement of debt. That's why there's two signatures on that instrument. We get into that quite well. But I want you to think about these trillions of dollars that are needed to facilitate the war. That comes with, besides the burden of the purchase of this material, it comes with the burden of the interest to facilitate the mechanisms of war. And your children are still paying for it. And they will continue. Because like we demonstrated, 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. It took a matter of less than 2 years before we had a new enemy, and we had Gulf War I in 1991. Okay, and let us not forget the bankers who financed this great war. If anyone had the cream of the profits, it was the bankers. Being partnerships rather than incorporated organizations, they do not have to report to stockholders, and their profits were as secret as they were immense. How the bankers made their millions and their billions, I do not know, because those little secrets never became public, even before a Senate investigatory body. But here's how some of the other patriotic industrials and speculators chiseled their way into the profits. Folks, for time's sake, I could get into this because he really sums it up quite well. He gets into the people of the shoes and so forth, even down to mosquito netting. Mosquito netting was rather interesting because he gets into here. Also, somebody else had a lot of mosquito netting. They sold your Uncle Sam 20 million mosquito nets for the use of soldiers overseas. And I suppose the boys were expected to put it over them as they tried to sleep in the muddy trenches. One hand scratching cooties on their backs and the other making passes at scurrying rats. Well, not one of those mosquito nets ever got to France. Folks, they made 20 million mosquito nets, and none of them ever got into the theater of war. Okay? He also gets into a lot about boots. There was 26,000 pair of boots that were left over from World War I that were never issued to the American soldier. All right? Folks, it goes on and goes on and goes on here. It's been estimated by statisticians and economists and researchers that the cost, that the war cost to Uncle Sam was $52 trillion. And of this sum, 39 trillion was expended in the actual war itself. This expenditure yielded $16 trillion in profits. This is how the 21,000 billionaires and millionaires made their money. This $16 trillion in profits is not to be sneezed at. It is quite a tidy sum, and it went to a very few. So what's he saying here is that when you look at the whole cost of the war, you had $52 trillion. Folks, this is 1914 money, 1918 money. $52 trillion is an astronomical amount even today in 2009. I want you to think of $52 trillion, folks, in 1914, okay? When a candy bar that today cost $1.25 or $1.40 was a nickel. I want you to think of that purchasing power to these people of profits of $16 trillion. you can buy a lot of politicians and a lot of judges in 1914 or in 2009 for that matter with $16 trillion. And again, folks, you got to think about that was all placed in financing and through taxation on your shoulders. And this is why I say they make the profits and we bleed. And nothing has changed since this, folks. I know we're running out of time here, but maybe we have the time to get into some small things with regards to profits of war today. Okay, I just opened up this book. First thing we come to. A $59 billion investment made in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan prior to us going into Afghanistan. Washington is, this is prior to us going into Afghanistan, folks. Washington is currently proposing a $3 billion pipeline from Uzbekistan to the Caspian Sea through Georgia into Turkey's Mediterranean coast, a lengthy and expensive project. U.S. companies could build a similar pipeline for the Central Asia through Afghanistan at less than half the cost. If the next Afghan government can guarantee our security, Russia fears that it is exactly what's happened is the Americans want and now have U.S. troops based in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. That was in May of 2001. So you take into consideration the oil interest and pipeline interest and logistical interest of Afghanistan. You take into consideration the cost of this pipeline and the profits to the powers to be. You take into consideration the phony statement that Osama bin Forgotten, who needs dialysis once a week, carried out and facilitated a military intelligence operation with 19 untrained hijackers against the United States government and the mechanisms of defense and intelligence agencies we have. Folks, how can this man be in a cave in Afghanistan when he needs dialysis every week? Of course, we did get into how he was between July 14th and July 28th of 2001. We know that he was in the American University Hospital in Dubai in July of 2001. See, Roosevelt's statement comes back to you and hits you right in the face. Nothing in politics happens by chance. The profits, the gains by the few at the cost of the many. Now, let's get into a little bit of World War II. Profits. And I'm just going to read this verbatim. This was written by a man by the name of Webster Topley. Webster Topley, folks, is a modern-day historian. And you remember that famous quote by Napoleon Bonaparte that we've used before? Basically that, history is agreed upon lies by the victors. Well, Webster Topley researches beyond the agreed upon lies. George W. Bush's grandfather, Prescott Bush, was the managing director of the investment bank Brown Brothers Harriman from the 1920s through the 1940s. It was Brown Brothers, in conjunction with Averell Harriman, the Rockefeller family, Standard Oil Company, the DuPonts, Morgans, and the Fords, who served as the principal funding arm in helping to finance Adolf Hitler's rise to power starting in 1923. Let's go back over them people, folks. Okay, the Bush family, Brown Brothers, Averell Harriman, Rockefeller family, Standard Oil Company. Now that's Saucony, Standard Oil Company of New York, another Rockefeller institution. The DuPonts, the Morgans, and the Fords, all supporting and funding Adolf Hitler's rise to power. Early support from Hitler came from Prescott Bush to the Hamburg American Line, also funded by Brown Brothers, that funneled large sums of money and weapons to Hitler's stormtroopers in the 1920s. Calling President Bush Hitler's Angels, a 1942 edition of calling Prescott Bush Hitler's Angel, a 1942 edition of the New York Herald Tribune reported that Adolf Hitler's financer held $3 million for Nazi bigwigs in the Union Bank. Prescott Bush was one of the New York Bank's 7 directors. His son and grandson would soon become U.S. presidents in the shadow of the swastika. The Bush family fortune was made from the Third Reich. Former U.S. Justice Department Nazi war criminal investigator John Loftus told the Sarasota Herald in November of 2000. Adolf Hitler's blueprint for a posthumous pharmaceutical Fourth Reich was financed by billions of dollars in gold and other loot sniped out of Germany and Japan at the end of the war. Paul Manning, who credited CIA Director Alan Dulles for his guidance in writing Martin Borum's Nazi in Exile, cites IG Farben documents in confirming that this flight capital assured the rise of a Fourth Reich built by a global petrochemical, pharmaceutical, and banking cartel, alternatively called Norodom. And I hope I'm pronouncing that right for you, but in English it means new order. So folks, you got to understand who finances these wars, how they sell these wars to you, how they create the crisis to get the reaction from you. So you will not only put yourself into debt, you will not only allow the government to take away your liberties and your safeties, but they will also make you desire to send your sons and daughters to bleed for the profits of the few, as General Smedley Butler said so eloquently. Folks, again, we're out of time. I find this hour to be extremely quick. There is a lot more we can get into with regards to the profits of war. But if you look at the main players in this past war, okay, you get into Dick Cheney, former executive Halliburton, who prior to becoming vice president oversaw all the contracts with Halliburton. Kellogg Root and Brown, otherwise known as KRB, again, another Halliburton subsidiary. You get into the media, you know, General Electric owning NBC. So, you know, one of the biggest defense contractors in the world, for that matter, own a big stick of the media that makes you want and desire to go to war. In other shows, we get into the missing $2.3 trillion of Pentagon funds that Defense Secretary Rumsfeld so eloquently and blatantly talked about at a public forum. So, folks, you got to understand there's no accountability on their part. All the accountability is placed on you, and all the liability is also placed on the shoulders of the American people. Ask questions and look for the answers, and I think you will be startled at what you will discover. As always, folks, we thank you very, very much for your busy time to share with us. We hope you will join us next week. And as always, we remind you that your government is your business. Thank you for watching.